Today we are solving one simple problem: what to read first in Tolkien's Middle-earth, and what to save for later. J.R.R. Tolkien wrote this legendarium as modern myth, with a calm, old-world tone, songs and languages, and a sense of deep history behind every place. Reading it feels like stepping into a vast map where the main story is clear, while the background lore can go as deep as you want. This video gives you two paths. Path 1 is the beginner order, optimized for momentum and emotional clarity. Path 2 is the deep lore order, optimized for people who want the history, the names, and the long echoes behind the main story. The key axis is order versus depth. If you start too deep, you get overwhelmed. If you start too shallow, you may miss why some moments feel so weighty. The ulterior is the golden rule. For your first trip through Middle-earth, prioritize the narrative books that were designed to be read like a story. Then, when you already know you love the world, add the lore books as optional rewards. This approach is also the most practical for buying and reading. You can start with one book, decide if the tone fits you, and continue without pressure. Before we list anything, one quick note on editions. The titles and the story are consistent across print, ebook, and audiobook. What changes is pacing. Audiobook versions can make the poetry and older phrasing feel smoother, while print makes maps and appendices easier to reference. Now let's map the two paths clearly, and then I will tell you the single best beginner starting point. Path 1 is the beginner path. This is the order that most people finish, understand, and remember. It uses two principles. First, you begin with the book that teaches you how Tolkien sounds on the page, without demanding that you memorize history. Second, you move into the central trilogy in the exact order it was built to be read. Beginner path in one line is The Hobbit, then The Lord of the Rings trilogy. The reason this works is not trivia, it is reading experience. The Hobbit is shorter, more direct, and easier to follow on a first pass. It establishes the style of travel, the feeling of old tales, and the idea that small choices can matter in a vast world. After that, The Lord of the Rings expands the scope. The prose becomes more layered. The world feels older. The stakes feel heavier. If you have already adjusted to Tolkien's voice, that shift feels natural instead of intimidating. This is also the order that helps you avoid common beginner mistakes, like starting with a lore compendium and then quitting because it reads like a history book. In the next section, I will state the recommended order as a simple checklist. After that, we will briefly describe what each book is like to read, with no plot details and no character names. The goal is confidence. You should know what you are buying, what kind of reading commitment it is, and what to expect from the tone. Recommended beginner order, step by step. Step 1 is The Hobbit. Step 2 is The Fellowship of the Ring. Step 3 is The Two Towers. Step 4 is The Return of the King. If you only want one starting decision, start with The Hobbit. It is the gentlest entry, and it also makes the later trilogy feel like a widening of the same world rather than a sudden jump into dense mythology. A useful way to think about this is commitment level. The Hobbit is a single volume that you can finish and then decide. The Lord of the Rings is a continuous journey across 3 volumes, and many editions sell it as a boxed set or a single combined volume. Starting with The Hobbit lets you test whether you enjoy Tolkien's pacing, descriptions of landscapes, and older style of dialogue. If you do, you will likely enjoy the trilogy even more. If you do not, you stop without feeling like you failed a giant project. People sometimes ask if they should begin with The Fellowship of the Ring instead, since it is the first book of the main trilogy. That can work, especially if you already like slower epic fantasy. But for most new readers, The Hobbit is the best on-ramp. It reduces friction, and it makes the transition into the trilogy smoother. Now let's look at each of the 4 beginner books, what the reading experience feels like, and where people usually struggle. The Hobbit. This is the cleanest entry point because it reads like a self-contained adventure, with a lighter touch and a clearer through line. The language still has the Tolkien flavor, but it asks less of you in terms of genealogy, politics, and place name density. As a reading experience, The Hobbit is often described as warm and story-forward. Descriptions are vivid, but the pages move. That matters for beginners because it teaches your ear how Tolkien builds atmosphere without testing your patience too early. It also introduces you to the idea that Middle-earth is bigger than the immediate story. You feel history in the background, but you are not required to study it. If you are choosing formats, this is a great audiobook candidate because the narration can make the older phrasing feel natural. In print, it is also a comfortable first physical purchase, because it is one book, not a 3-volume commitment. Keep your focus simple. Read it as a complete experience. Do not stop to chase references or external timelines. The goal of the beginner path is momentum and confidence. When you finish, you will be ready for the trilogy, where the same world opens outward and becomes more epic, more layered, and more emotionally demanding. The Fellowship of the Ring. This is where Middle-earth becomes epic fantasy in the modern sense, with longer scenes, deeper atmosphere, and more attention to culture and place. Many readers notice that the pacing is slower than typical contemporary fantasy. That is not a flaw. It is Tolkien building a believable world texture. Your job as a first-time reader is to follow the journey on the page, not to memorize every term. If a song, a poem, or a historical reference goes past you, let it pass. The story still works. This volume is also where maps and chapter breaks can help. If you are reading in print or ebook, glancing at a map can reduce confusion without turning the experience into homework. The reason you must read this before anything deeper is simple. The Fellowship of the Ring teaches you the emotional grammar of the trilogy. It shows you how Tolkien balances quiet travel, sudden danger, and long stretches of reflection. Once you accept that rhythm, the next 2 volumes feel more intense rather than more difficult. A practical tip is to read in consistent sessions. Tolkien's style rewards continuity. Even 20 minutes a day can keep the tone in your head, which makes the prose feel smoother and the world feel more coherent. The Two Towers? This volume often feels faster because the structure creates a stronger sense of forward motion. The tone is still classic and measured, but the decisions and consequences feel closer together, which many readers find energizing. The most important order-related point here is that this book assumes you already have the trilogy's baseline language and geography in your mind. If you start here without the previous volume, you lose context and you will likely misread what matters. Read it as the middle act of one long story. That mindset removes pressure. You do not need to treat it like a separate novel with its own complete arc. In terms of reading experience, expect more variety in setting and more contrast between quieter stretches and higher tension stretches. Tolkien uses that contrast to make the world feel wide, not just to keep the plot moving. If you find yourself slowing down, do not jump to lore material for clarification. Instead, keep going and let the narrative teach you what you need. When you read The Two Towers in its proper place, it becomes the bridge that makes the final volume land with full weight. The Return of the King. This is the concluding volume of the trilogy, and it works best when you arrive with the previous 2 books still fresh in your memory. The scale feels broader and the emotional tone can feel more solemn. That is part of why the beginner path matters. If you built your foundation with The Hobbit and then moved through the trilogy in order, the shift feels earned rather than heavy. Readers sometimes worry about being lost because Tolkien's world has many names and many layers. At this stage, you do not need to know the entire history. You only need to recognize recurring places and ideas. If you want a simple technique, keep a tiny note list of place names that repeat. 2 or 3 words per item is enough. This volume also contains material that some editions place in appendices. Appendices can be interesting, but they are optional for a first read. Treat them like bonus chapters you can explore later if you want more context. The beginner order ends here on purpose. You have completed the full narrative core that most readers mean when they say they have read Tolkien. Next, we shift to Path 2. That path is for people who finished the story and now want to understand the deep history that Tolkien built behind it. Path 2 is the deep lore path. This is not required to enjoy Tolkien. It is optional enrichment for readers who like mythic history, languages, and the feeling of a world that existed long before the main narrative. The 2 key books here are the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales of Numenor and Middle-earth. Think of these as reference-style reading. They are not written like the main story. They contain sweeping summaries, genealogies, and legendary events described at a high level. That is why they are best after the beginner path. Once you already care about the world, a history-like book becomes a reward instead of a barrier. If you are deciding what to buy, you do not need to purchase these up front. From an Amazon and budgeting perspective, the most reliable purchase for most viewers is still the narrative core, especially boxed sets of the trilogy. Lore books become a second-wave purchase after you finish and want more. In the next 2 sections, I will explain what each lore book is, who it is for, and how to read it without getting lost. The goal is to make the deep path feel inviting, not intimidating. The Silmarillion. This is the most famous deep lore book, and it is best approached as mythology rather than as a novel. If you open it expecting the same kind of chapter-by-chapter momentum as The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings, you may bounce off it. Instead, read it like a collection of foundational legends. You are learning the big shapes of the world, not following a single continuous storyline. A practical way to read the Silmarillion is in small portions. 1 chapter at a time is enough. Some readers also like to pair it with a map or a simple family tree, but keep it light. What makes this book valuable is the sense of scale it adds. places and names in the main story start to feel like echoes of older ages. That recognition can deepen your appreciation of Tolkien's tone, especially the feeling of melancholy and long memory that sits behind the prose. If you do not love it, that is normal. It is not a beginner book. If you do love it, it usually unlocks a new kind of enjoyment in Middle-earth, where you stop seeing the world as a setting and start seeing it as a layered history. Unfinished Tales of Numenor and Middle-earth. This book sits between narrative and reference. It contains expanded material, alternate versions, and additional background that Tolkien worked on but did not shape into a single finalized story. The key word is unfinished. You will see notes, variations, and pieces that do not always resolve cleanly. For many readers, that is the appeal. It feels like looking into the workshop. Read it after you have completed the core story, and ideally after you have sampled the Silmarillion, so the names and eras feel less abstract. A helpful approach is to treat each section as its own essay. You are not trying to speedrun it. Skim introductions, read the main text, and do not worry if you skip detailed annotations on a first pass. This is also a book where format matters. In print, flipping between text and notes is easier. In ebook, search can help you refine names quickly. If you are choosing just one lore add-on purchase after the core story, this is often the more practical pick for readers who want extra depth without committing fully to mythic history style. It gives you context and texture while staying closer to the reading experience of prose narratives. Common mistakes and how to avoid them. Mistake 1 is starting with the Silmarillion because you want to be complete. Completeness is not the same as a good first reading experience. A lore book first can make Middle-earth feel like homework, which is the opposite of what most beginners want. Mistake 2 is skipping The Hobbit because you heard it as a children's book. The Hobbit is beginner-friendly, but it is not disposable. It is a bridge into Tolkien's voice, and it makes the trilogy feel more approachable. Mistake 3 is treating the 3 volumes of The Lord of the Rings as optional or interchangeable. They are one continuous narrative split into 3 parts for practical publishing reasons. Read them in order without detours into lore material. Mistake 4 is trying to combine your first read with a deep dive timeline. Timelines and encyclopedias can be fun later, but they often reduce enjoyment early by pulling you out of the story every few pages. Mistake 5 is buying too much at once. The safest beginner purchase is one book first, then the trilogy. Lore books can wait until you know you want more. If you follow the 2-path system, you avoid almost every frustration people report. You get the story first, and you keep the deep history as a second phase reward. Final recap in plain language. If you want the best first-time reading experience, read The Hobbit, then The Fellowship of the Ring, then The Two Towers, then The Return of the King. That is the beginner path, and it is the path that most reliably turns a curious viewer into a confident reader. If you finish and want more depth, add the Silmarillion and then Unfinished Tales of Numenor and Middle-earth as optional lore expansions. They are valuable, but they are not required, and they should not come before the narrative core. This structure is designed to reduce decision fatigue. You do not need to choose everything today. Start with one book, see if Tolkien's tone works for you, and only then commit to the trilogy set. That buying pattern is also the most sensible long-term approach. The core story is the most widely read, the easiest to gift, and the most consistently available in stable editions. If you want a simple personal rule, use this. Story first, lore second. With that rule, you can enjoy Middle-earth at your own depth level, without confusion and without pressure. In the description, keep the beginner order as a checklist so you can come back later and continue exactly where you left off.